Welcome. I'm Glen Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that deal with peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. After September 11, 2001, Bush launched what he called a war on terror. We are now more than 6 years into that. As a nation, we're long overdue for a serious public conversation about what that really means. Is a so-called war on terror the right way to deal with the world's problems? During this hour, we'll explore these issues with a very knowledgeable guest. As a nation, we can benefit from what Steve Niva has to share with us, and I look forward to having that conversation. We need to understand why people are doing some of the activities they're doing that are violent and fear-inducing. In order to deal effectively with the kind of violence that's happening, we need to understand their motives, why they're resorting to those tactics, and we need to figure out how to devise more effective policies and methods to solve the underlying problems. And Steve Niva is here with us to share his information, his knowledge, his insights. Dr. Niva teaches international politics and Middle East studies at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. He has written about U.S. foreign policy and the Middle East for Middle East Report magazine, and his recent writings have also appeared in Peace Review, Middle East International, Al Aram Weekly, the Seattle Times, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, Common Dreams, and Counterpunch, among others. And he's currently writing a book about Israel's military response to suicide bombings. You got your hands full. I'm glad you were able to join us for this program. It's good to have you here, Steve.
Thanks a lot, Glenn. I'm glad to be here.
6 years ago, after 9/11, Bush declared a so-called war on terror. And in the name of fighting what he called terrorism, Bush invaded Afghanistan, he invaded Iraq, he keeps the U.S. military occupying both of those countries. He's threatened military violence in other parts of the world. Here at home, he's invaded our privacy, he's taken away many of our freedoms and constitutional rights, all of this in the guise of a so-called war on terror. And a thoughtful person has to ask, is that effective? Is that the right solution? Has the so-called war on terror made us any safer?
Oh, I'd argue it has not. In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, it's true, certainly, that there hasn't been another attack like 9/11, but that's not because of, let's say, the Patriot Act. It's not because we wait in long lines in airports now and take our shoes off. It's not because AT&T can now trawl our phone records for possible discussions of terrorism, and certainly not because we invaded Iraq or Afghanistan and still maintain occupations there. The primary reason why we've not been attacked since 9/11, it has to do with strategic reasons from the point of view of the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda that committed the horrible atrocities on 9/11. They've strategically decided not to attack us because we have done almost everything that they were hoping we would do. They were hoping to lure the United States into a long, protracted war in the Middle East. We'll talk more about their strategy probably later, but to embroil the Middle East in conflict because they felt that was their only chance to achieve some of their aims, which would be overthrowing some of the dictatorships that we back in the Middle East. But I think let's step more broadly why we are not any safer. Let's start with the first important point. Osama bin Laden and his right-hand man, Ayman Zawahiri, are still at large. In fact, not only are they still at large, they've reconstituted an Al-Qaeda network in Pakistan, in the tribal hinterlands, Waziristan it's called, in Pakistan. Not only that, Al-Qaeda has now become a global franchise. In the same way as McDonald's or Starbucks are opening up franchises around the world, Al-Qaeda is now opening up franchises. Disgruntled groups around the world are adopting the Al-Qaeda label. And in fact, as we know, terrorism has not decreased since we launched the war on terror. In fact, it increased. There were attacks in Spain, in England, in Morocco, in Algeria, in Egypt, in Bali. I mean, the list goes on. And then let's add a few more things. Iraq, which is a country where there was not any Al-Qaeda or any terrorist group before we invaded, now has become the primary training ground for terrorists around the region who then get experience and have gone on to Jordan and other countries to commit acts of terror. So we're not any safer. In fact, many people are saying that Al-Qaeda is reconstituted and may likely shift strategies sometime soon. I sure hope they don't. But our policies have done nothing really to prevent that.
Yeah, Iraq is an ancient country. That's Mesopotamia. That's, and they have no history anywhere back for thousands of years of any suicide bombers.
No.
And now that's the leading place after Bush's invasion. So Bush's invasion is what provoked all of that.
Absolutely. Bush's invasion has created what one CIA document is called the West Point of terrorism, a training ground where people who want to experiment in guerrilla warfare, terrorist tactics, can now learn their trade.
Yeah. And certainly elevated the status of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. After the Cold War, we had no Soviet Union to interact with. And so here this thing comes along and we elevated them to the status of the former Soviet Union as our counterpoint in the world. So it gave them enormous status that they never would have had before if Bush had not played right into their hands.
Yeah, that's another reason why, another piece of evidence of why our policy has been so counterproductive. Al-Qaeda is now a household name, and people associate it with opposition to American policies or other policies they don't like. Many people had never heard of this organization until we raised them to the stature of global enemy number one.
And then if somebody doesn't like what the United States does in whatever country they may live in, they know that's the brand name to latch onto.
Absolutely, we've helped their we've been their greatest marketing strategy.
It's a phenomenal marketing blunder on the part of the United States.
Absolutely.
Some people say that we're fighting the wrong war, that after September 11 we should have done more to go after Osama bin Laden. We already went in and overthrew Afghanistan and put an oil company, some oil company people in charge of Afghanistan. But they say we should have pursued Osama bin Laden even into Pakistan or wherever instead of getting distracted by Iraq. So what do you say that, for these people who say that we got distracted in Iraq and we should be chasing, are we fighting the wrong war?
Well, yes and no. Indeed, the war in Afghanistan has been entirely derailed by the war in Iraq. For example, now we know that the Taliban, who ostensibly we went into Afghanistan to overthrow, are now resurgent in the south and in parts of the north. Suicide bombings are in an increase. They'd never happened before in Afghanistan during all the wars with the Soviet Union. Now they are happening with great regularity. So indeed, the resources that could have gone to securing and stabilizing the country haven't happened. But here's where I would say we're really fighting the wrong war. We're fighting the wrong war by waging war on terrorism, or as we've said, the war on terrorism. Our program will discuss this more, but the main point is we shouldn't have fought a war afterwards. 9/11 was, I think clear to many, it was a crime against humanity. It was a violation of human rights and basic human dignity of the grandest scale, and it most likely deserved a legal response, a police response, a intelligence response, not the response of war. And instead what we've done, as we've just given this list of all the counterproductive things that are happening around the world that are making us less safe, not more, by trying to wage war on terror, which is simply a tactic, we've actually increased the amount of people who are sympathetic to these groups that want to attack us or have anger and resentment against us. So we're fighting the wrong war, not simply that we're in Iraq, but that we were even fighting a war to begin with.
Right.
We could have handled bin Laden in many different ways, including negotiating with the Taliban, snatching bin Laden. I mean, that was quite possible right after 9/11. And not only that, launching a global manhunt to every single one of the Al-Qaeda network that was part of the conspiracy of 9/11 itself. But instead, we waged war. We lost that opportunity.
Yeah, because right at that time, the rest of the world was with us.
Absolutely.
And Iran had offered help. Iran had offered the United States help in finding the people who had done it, and so forth. And we could have taken advantage of that. Instead, we've somehow tried to push Iran into a corner and threaten war on them too when they were trying to help.
Yeah.
And the rest of the world, you know, if, like you say, if we had treated this as a crime and under international law and gone after it in a law enforcement way, we have international courts where you can deal with that.
Absolutely.
And we could have had the support of the world in treating this as a crime. Instead, we've provoked people all around the world and essentially declared war on one of the major religions of the world that has believers worldwide.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's just a bizarre, amazingly counterproductive thing. One of the other things that comes to mind is with the so-called war on terror, where we go in and we've really messed up Afghanistan a lot, and we've messed up Iraq. We'll talk more about Iraq. One of the things that happens in these wars is you end up with a lot of refugees. A lot of people get displaced. And what about? Can you talk about that? Just the sense of
Well, it's part of the bigger problem that when you use conventional military force against a very small enemy who hides in the population, you're going to create great havoc. And indeed, using conventional force to ostensibly to go after Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan essentially gutted the country. We had to sort of destroy the country in order to catch the small enemy that we were after, and we still didn't catch him. And the same is true of what's happened in Iraq. We essentially brought Iraq to a situation of ground zero where the country's infrastructure is entirely destroyed. And in the process, you're going to have great displacement of populations, which leads to instability across the region. In Iraq, we know today there's over 2 million refugees living in squalor. And you can't tell me that these are not hotbeds of possible recruitment for groups like Al-Qaeda, for other extremist groups that have an agenda against the United States, and let alone simply the humanitarian catastrophe that's confronting the region.
Yeah, we've cost these people their homes, their hometowns, their occupations. You have to give up your profession or give up your business or whatever, and you become displaced. And then if you're disgruntled, then who are you going to blame?
We've created a situation of blowback.
As well as spilling over into other countries. And we've seen this before with the United States' interventions in Latin America, where we've caused huge amounts of refugees from Guatemala and other countries, and people don't, and when they come to this country as illegal immigrants, then people get mad at them, and we don't realize how much we've caused that. Likewise, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, that in the 60s and 70s, the United States provoked this refugee crisis from there. I mean,
and then we've been shameful with the people that worked with us in Iraq, for example. We haven't let them in. they face death
they're gonna be,
in
they'll
Iraq. They're going to be killed
because they've been
because they were working with the United States, and yet we've hung them out to dry. And you can't tell me that people in the region don't see that and take notice, and they say, "Oh, well, I work with the United States. Let's see what these people who did work with the United States, what happened to them." Well, the United States just left them out to dry. So it's a terrible strategy, a terrible policy that we followed.
When the United States brags about being the world's only superpower, we somehow feel like this makes us special. We're the world's only superpower. When we get into conflicts with other people around the world, how does our excessive power come into play? How does that affect the conflict?
Well, I think this is the fundamental issue of what's wrong with the war on terror, for example, today, and what's wrong in Iraq as well. The U.S. military is the most powerful, most technologically advanced. It has some of the best skilled fighting personnel and equipment in the world, bar none. And if we're confronted with a conventional opponent or enemy, there's no question who would win. The United States would dominate in any sort of land conflict or land war. However, when you're fighting against insurgent groups, guerrilla groups, terrorist groups in these organizations, all that conventional military superiority goes out the window. Because then you're in an entirely different kind of conflict, what military strategists and others now call asymmetric warfare.
Asymmetrical meaning not having symmetry, not having balance.
Not being on the level playing field, but where one is so much asymmetrically more powerful in conventional military force than the other. And that's the era of warfare that we are now entering. That's what 9/11 helped bring about. That's what we're seeing around the world. And what that means is that it poses a great challenge, especially to the United States, because the only wars that we've ever lost have been asymmetrical conflicts: Vietnam, Lebanon, and right now in Iraq. And the fundamental problem is that when you have an enemy that's using asymmetrical tactics, that means it's trying to find ways to change the nature of the battle, because it can't win conventionally. It has to win unconventionally by doing flying planes into buildings, IEDs, suicide bombings, other kinds of strategies. However horrible they are, they make absolutely perfect sense from the point of view of an asymmetrically inferior opponent. When you use military force against this kind of opponent, some sort of guerrilla insurgency or terrorist organization, inevitably what you do, it's like using a hammer against a fly. You create backwash. You create collateral damage, as they call it. You create casualties. You create mayhem. You create chaos. First of all, you're not able to actually get at the enemy you're searching for, because you've got this conventional military. Secondly, you usually, by using a conventional military to respond to these actions, you're creating more enemies than you need. And thirdly, you're creating greater motivation in your opponent. And so what history has shown is that actually those with the superior conventional militaries are not any better. In fact, often quite worse in these kinds of conflicts. And that's a problem we're facing today.
We saw that in Vietnam, where people would complain, you don't know who the enemy is. It could be any one of us, any one of them, and because they would blend into the population, because they were the population. There's no difference. And the only way would be to exterminate an entire population, to do genocide. And some of our policies sort of bordered on that, as we go through and wipe out villages and burn down everybody's houses and stuff. And all that does is make things worse. And we're seeing those kinds of policies here. And like I said, our vast military power is of no use, even if you go back to September 11, because the United States had been spending hundreds of billions of dollars every year. We had thousands of nuclear weapons, but thousands of nuclear weapons couldn't protect us against a couple guys with box cutters.
Absolutely. That's classic asymmetric warfare.
And so we were, it's like this gigantic military budget of hundreds of billions of dollars was a fraud. It was a hoax. It was a scam from the military industrial, because they couldn't defend us. They call it the Department of Defense, but it's their headquarters, the Pentagon, that got attacked.
I think that's a fundamental truth about where we are with the U.S. military budget right now, which is, and I think still to this day, is that it's primarily supply driven. And what I mean by that is that Our bloated military budget, the latest, fanciest, most high-tech, sophisticated equipment that we have, including weapons even into space, is primarily driven by the suppliers for these goods. In other words, the military-industrial corporate complex that exists now in this country, not by the demand. In fact, the demand for national security right now is primarily from guerrilla insurgencies, terrorist organizations, and the like around the world today. The weaponry that we have, that we're spending billions of dollars a year to provide, are not meeting that security need. They aren't responding to the real threats in the world. We have no competitor anywhere. We have no competitor. We don't even have rising competitors. China is largely a mythical enemy. It's not in any way a threat to the United States at this time. Iran certainly has been so overrated as an enemy. It's all about what they might do if they might get something, that they might be able to put in a delivery vehicle, that they might do this. They are all extreme hypotheticals. And so our military budget is clearly, I think a fraud is the right word to use here.
There's another example in the Middle East where I know you've studied extensively and also lived, with the case of Israel and Palestine, where there's this asymmetry.
Absolutely.
This very stark imbalance. Can you just address that
Sure,
briefly in this context?
Yeah, most people, they think of the Israeli conflict now, they think of suicide bombings, right? And also many people tend to have this image of that conflict as being one where tiny, surrounded little Israel is being besieged by Muslims and Arabs who are strapping bombs to themselves to attack them. In fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Switch the picture. Israel, the fourth most powerful military in the world, has nuclear capability, has probably ounce for ounce the most effective air force in the world, is up against a largely civilian population who have a ragtag bunch of guerrilla groups who, in classic asymmetrical fashion, have found, at least some of them, the more extremist groups, who reject most political solutions, have found that, for them, the option for military coercion would be asymmetrical, unconventional warfare, i.e. suicide bombings, which they learned from Lebanon, because the Lebanese group Hezbollah actually defeated Israel in Lebanon. Israel's great, powerful military was not able to hold its illegal occupation of Lebanon because a ragtag, soon-to-be very sophisticated group called Hezbollah used suicide bombings and other tactics to drive them out. So Israel's also a classic case of asymmetrical warfare, where the more powerful conventional military force is really up against an enemy that is able to defy it through using unconventional tactics. And Israel has not succeeded in quelling this insurgency against it because it refuses to deal with the political issue, which is Israel's occupation. It refuses to come up with a political solution that would meet the aspirations of Palestinians to have an own independent state. And because it does, unfortunately, it's faced the extremist groups using weapons like suicide bombings.
You know, another example comes to mind here in the United States. We, in our school textbooks on U.S. history and just in our collective historical memory, we take pride in the American Revolution, the patriots who fought the British Empire. And if you think about this, the British Empire in that era of the 1700s, 1770s, was really a gigantic worldwide empire. The American colonies were this little ragtag, as you say, bunch of people. The
Militias,
British had all kinds of stuff. They had ships, they had all kinds of stuff. They had bright red uniforms. They'd march out in straight lines. And the American colonists, the patriots, whom we would now call insurgents, were hiding behind trees, blending in with the population, doing, our national history is based on insurgents declaring independence from an empire because the technology wasn't as sophisticated, it wasn't as grossly asymmetrical, but the sense of it was there, and the people who were the insurgents we now look on as patriots and nationalists.
Glenn, that's an absolutely great point. In fact, I think if you want to understand the situation in Iraq today, or between Israel and the Palestinians, or in a number of other cases, say the Chechens in Russia, or in other situations we have in the world today, you could do a lot worse than examine the American experience, where you have a foreign occupation by an empire, as you rightly described, with a superior conventional military force, trying to impose its occupation over another people. And not only did the American militias that initially responded, I mean, think of the attacks on the retreating British soldiers after Lexington and Concord, and I mean, you could go down the list.
Yeah.
But Britain was unable to defeat the political will for independence.
That's right. It was our land. People knew it, that this is our land. Britain has no right to dominate us.
Right.
We knew that.
Exactly. And that's the issue that's at stake in the Palestinian case with Israel and in Iraq with the United States, is that the insurgency is primarily, it's not terrorist, although it uses terrorist tactics at times, which is what the British more or less called the Americans.
Yeah.
But it's primarily a nationalist resistance against foreign military occupation, and there's no way to win in that situation without making political concessions. And that's why the British lost, that's why the French lost in Algeria, that's why the Israelis have not been able to crush Palestinian resistance, and that's why the U.S. will not win in Iraq unless it makes political concessions to the desire for Iraqi independence, which would certainly, we know, would mean no permanent military bases, those 13 forward operating bases, the 4 major super bases, the world's largest embassy in Baghdad, and no control over Iraqi oil, which is these oil contracts which we've been imposing on the Iraqis right now.
Yeah, when we set up the puppet government, we made it, we forced laws through that says that our oil companies get special privileges and that you can't sue us and all kinds of stuff. And then we've been trying to force both political parties, Republicans and Democrats in Congress, have been trying to force through this thing through the Iraqi parliament that turns over their oil to mainly U.S. companies. And the American people don't realize this.
And everybody in Iraq knows about this.
Everybody in Iraq knows, and
everybody in Iraq knows about it. In America, we don't really know about this because we're not supposed to know about this. But in Iraq, they know about this. And these two things, the bases and oil, I say ultimately will defeat any American project in Iraq that does not recognize that we have to declare unambiguously that we will have nothing to do with permanent military bases controlling Iraq's oil, and eventually, of course, I would say immediately, we need to declare a timeline for withdrawal so we can get a negotiated political process going.
Yeah, you a moment ago, you mentioned the underlying political grievances in these places, and that's what it comes down to there, and that's what it was in the American colonies. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, it's mostly, there's some reasoning saying we have a right to self-determination, but much of the Declaration of Independence was a list of the political grievances
against King George.
King George was taking our stuff for his troops. King George was housing his troops in our homes. King George was doing this. He was not listening to us. He was doing blah, 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 taxation without representation. There's a whole list of things.
If you put President Bush is doing that in Iraq to all of those lists, it would actually be a fairly similar list.
It matches.
Or in Israel, or the Israeli army is doing this to us as well.
But your sense that the underlying political grievances must be dealt with seems like the key to solving the problem.
There's a new book out now by William Polk, former State Department official. He was in Vietnam, studied counterinsurgency in Vietnam, actually was a participant in that in Vietnam, and then later became a professor of Middle East Studies and more. And he's recently written a book called Violent Politics: The History of Counterinsurgency, Guerrilla Warfare, and Terrorism in the 20th Century. And what he shows is that in every case of counterinsurgency, bar perhaps one or two, the stronger side, the asymmetrically superior side, has been defeated because it tried to impose a foreign occupation or foreign control in the face of the desire for national liberation. And what that shows is the reason why the strong defeat the weak defeat the strong primarily has to do with will, staying power. They have time. And they're willing to take their time to wear down. Exactly.
And they live there.
That's why they have the will to.
They'll be there a year from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. They'll still be there. And unless we're willing to occupy them for the next 100 years, or 200 years, or 500 years, you can't do that.
So to stick with the Iraqi case, that's why everyone should be trying to figure out how best to get out of Iraq as soon as possible, because there's no way to defeat this militarily.
You know, we mentioned suicide bombing, and you hear just kind of circulating around some notion that this is some Islamic thing.
Right.
Oh, that's Muslims do that.
Right.
People don't realize that in Islam, suicide is a sin. The religion actually opposes suicide quite vigorously.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you think of different societies, even in this country, we just had a few days before we taped the program, we had Veterans Day, where the United States honors people who gave their lives for the country, and which we do on Memorial Day, we do on Veterans Day, and we have this notion, and this isn't a society that glorifies killing ourselves, but for those people who, quote, gave their lives to the country, we honor that.
Right.
And even in Christianity, Jesus says, there's no greater love than to lay down your life for a friend. And we have this notion that comes out in society after society, but somehow we make a special deal out of it in a blaming way.
Right.
And the suicide bombing really is an act of desperation because they don't have viable political alternatives.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, first, let me deal with the first point you were making, which is that there's nothing inherently Islamic about suicide bombing. It's more an accident of history that the first real suicide bombing campaign in the modern period happened in Lebanon in response to the Israeli occupation of Lebanon in 1982, and then the U.S. military backing of the Israeli occupation, which led to those massive, the first series of suicide truck bombings against the CIA station in Beirut, and then against the U.S. Marine barracks compound, which we now know was probably the largest non-nuclear explosion in the last 2 decades, was there. But after Lebanon, suicide bombings were conducted by non-Muslim groups around the world, and actually the pioneer for individual human suicide bombing, not truck suicide bombing, but where you strap, who invented actually the suicide bomb belt, is the Sri Lankan Tamil Tigers, who are a kind of Marxist Hindu organization. They're not Muslim, they're not religious. And then the PKK, the Kurdish political military organization, they're Marxist, not Muslim. And a number of other groups and organizations have conducted these kinds of actions. It just so happens that I think because of the example of Hezbollah, because they were so effective in defeating Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon, that they've inspired people to emulate them. And that's really the story, not the religion, but rather people, as you said, Glenn, understanding that when you're confronting a superior conventional military enemy, you need to use unconventional tactics. And as horrific as they may have been, suicide bombings are, in some ways, the ultimate smart bomb because they are very difficult to stop. I mean, just from a purely strategic, leave aside the moral question, purely tactical point of view, they make perfectly good sense because you can arrive at your target exactly how you want it. You're in control of the operation from start to finish, et cetera, right? And it's very difficult to deter.
It's an act of desperation for somebody who's just really up against the wall. And this is what we had with the kamikaze pilots.
That's
true
too.
Japanese kamikaze pilots who would deliberately fly their plane into U.S. warships. That was near the end of World War II when Japan was clearly being defeated. This wasn't toward the beginning, and the kamikazes who sacrificed their own lives were doing it toward the end of the war because Japan was losing, and it was that act of desperation.
The Battle of Fredericksburg in the Civil War, where I think it was the Irish Brigade, I've read about them, who knew that they were going to die, and yet ran into the enemy's lines, knowing that they were committing suicide. Essentially, they were dying. They were going to be killed. There was no question about it. But let me add something, though, Glenn. It's partly a product of desperation and a lack of political alternative, no question. But the other thing about suicide bombings that you find is there's not been a case of an organization using suicide bombings in any concerted way that has not been a case where there's been foreign military occupation. Really? Sri Lanka, it's the Sinhalese Buddhist government is an occupation. They want to liberate the Tamil homeland. The Lebanese were trying to liberate their land from Israel's occupation. The Palestinians have tried to liberate their land from Israel's occupation. The PKK were trying to liberate the southern Turkey to create a Kurdistan from what they believe to be Turkish occupation. In Iraq, which is now the suicide bombing leader in the world.
Yeah.
That's against primarily against in the context of a foreign occupation,
Yeah.
although we knew they've used them for sectarian reasons
Yeah.
too. But primarily as a strategy to create mayhem to make it difficult to occupy. So every case where you see suicide bombings in the world today, oh, and Chechnya as well, against the Russian occupation, you find foreign military occupation. So that's really the source here, is foreign military occupation, not Islam.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Let's talk for a bit about getting into the Iraq War, the Rumsfeld-Cheney model. What was their approach? I mean, the Iraq War was conceived by these people who had this agenda.
Yeah.
Tell us about the Cheney-Rumsfeld approach, and why did that go wrong? And we're running a bit late, but we want to cover this because I think that's important.
Well, and this relates to our whole discussion here of asymmetric warfare. Donald Rumsfeld certainly will go.
He was Secretary of Defense.
Secretary of Defense certainly will go down as being the worst Secretary of Defense, I think, in American history, and not simply for the Iraq War, but I would say primarily because he tried to undertake what he called the Revolution in Military Affairs, RMA. In other words, to change the U.S. military from reliance on a large standing army, being able to do maneuver warfare and other sorts of things, to this high-tech, special ops, largely outsourced, corporate model in a sense, military sort of vehicle. And so basically what he wanted to do was invade Iraq on the cheap. Invade Iraq is such a way to promote this new RMA, Revolution Military Affairs model, which is why he resisted all the calls from so many well-informed people that you needed a large military, why he resisted having any Phase 4 plan. Phase 4 is what do you do after you've sort of taken over the country or defeated your enemy or whatever, and why he was in complete denial that there was an insurgency when it broke out in the summer of 2003. He wanted to do this in order to confirm his ridiculous notion of what warfare of the future would look like, which comes out of some cartoon book that I haven't read. And so therefore, he put the American military in a position where they really could not win, and has created this absolute mess of a quagmire in Iraq today.
So, and then once we were there, once our U.S. military was there, then as we've discussed, we created the insurgency.
Yes.
And tell us about this approach that General Petraeus, the new top guy over there, is doing.
Right.
What's his, and the counterinsurgency manual and that?
Yeah, sure.
line?
Well, first of all, anybody watching this program should go out and get a copy of Thomas Rick's book, Fiasco, the American Military Venture in Iraq. And he has chapters called How to Create Insurgency Part 1, How to Create Insurgency Part 2, and he gives in great detail how our very policies, let's say disbanding the Iraqi military to create all these people with weapons and no jobs, etc. All the policies, many of us are familiar with them, how they actually created insurgency, and then how at first our response to the insurgency was largely the Israeli method, which is to go in, use escalating force, and to try and crush the insurgency right away. That use of force created widespread, proliferating support for the insurgency. It gave them a place to hide. It gave them communal support. And that's what fueled the insurgency. So the thing is that we have some very intelligent, well-informed people in our military. There's no question about it. And some of the smartest and best informed military officers immediately understood that this was a losing game, that trying to crush an insurgency with overwhelming force, like in Vietnam, like in all these other cases, was not going to work. And so they were led by figures like Colonel H.R. McMaster, who was in the North. Now we know General David Petraeus, and a number of other figures that are important. And they were pushing for this idea that actually what we needed was a shift strategy from a violent occupation to a sort of hearts and minds strategy, classic counterinsurgency.
Hearts and minds will be familiar to viewers who remember the Vietnam era.
Right.
Because President Johnson kept saying how we have to win the hearts and minds.
Right.
I mean, he knew he would say that it's not just a military thing. You've got to win their hearts and minds.
Right.
And yet, what we did in Vietnam was we'd go into these villages, burn down the people's houses, kill their we'd shoot their farm animals from helicopters
Right.
and stuff.
Destroy
and we'd
cropland, put
bomb
them into
the-
strategic
yeah.
hamlets,
It
and
was
yeah.
horrible, horrible,
Yeah.
horrible atrocities
Yeah.
against the population under the guise of trying to win their hearts and minds. And it's
Right.
like, no matter how many people we killed, winning their hearts and minds just got farther and farther away, and then we couldn't figure that out.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think what you can say is, and that's absolutely true in the case of Vietnam, is that these people around Petraeus and around this group of military officers, particularly in the Army and the Marines, in some ways wanted to get right what we got wrong in Vietnam. They actually believed that had we done it right, had we really truly done hearts and minds, classic counterinsurgency strategy, learned from the French experience in Vietnam. They're all focused on the issue of Algeria.
Yeah.
They're all reading books about Algeria. They're all watching the film Battle of Algiers. They're all trying to look for lessons of how to actually get it right. They actually truly want to apply this strategy. However, and here's the absolute crux, which fits in with the conversation we've had so far, not only is it, on the one hand, too little too late. In other words, the situation in Iraq has spiraled out of control, where there's no way to actually get popular support to your cause, to turn the people away from an insurgency, and certainly now also couple that with a civil war. Not only is that not possible, but they certainly don't have the troops to do it either. I mean, there's really no chance that they can actually carry out the policy. And then, finally, I think the most important point here is that Iraq is one of those cases that's simply not militarily winnable, no matter how much hearts and minds strategy you try, because, as we've been saying, you have a case where an insurgency is primarily a nationalist insurgency. It's not an Islamic insurgency, although there are Islamic parties. And it's primarily an insurgency against foreign occupation.
Right.
It's not primarily a civil war.
Right.
Civil war is a byproduct of the insurgent strategy
Right.
against the U.S.,
Yeah.
to create mayhem and chaos so that we can impose a foreign occupation, impose bases, and control their oil.
Yeah.
We're not going to be able to win, no matter how much. You can't do something wrong the right way.
Yeah.
And this is a classic case where these guys, no matter how smart their strategy is, and it is much smarter than what Rumsfeld was doing, which was idiotic, really, there's no chance really for it to succeed.
Well, and you'll see in the press, a lot of publicity. Oh yeah, we gave these neighborhood kids a
Yeah.
soccer ball
Yeah.
to play
Right.
with,
Right.
or we painted the front of this school building or something.
Yeah.
But that's not enough to counter the things that are not winning hearts and minds, like when you knock down somebody's door in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And you roust the Iraqi family out of bed, and you haul the men away and stick them in some prison and torture them, and you humiliate the women,
Yeah.
you ransack their house,
Yeah.
and you just, that's not winning hearts and minds, and that's what we are still doing. And giving some
We're doing it to a
neighborhood
less
kids
degree now because these people have come in, Petraeus and his group, and the new
that's-
surge has cut down on a lot of those practices. But still, because we are in such a hole, because the situation is so out of hand, they are relying upon heavy air power now, which is blowing up entire blocks in some cases. And also you have these security contractors which are running wild, like Blackwater, DynCorp, and these other groups, which are not under any control. This is a legacy of Rumsfeld as well, of privatizing the U.S. military.
Tell us about the counterinsurgency manual with Petraeus.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because part of what these guys were doing was they're trying to be smarter about this.
Right.
And so they put forth this counterinsurgency manual that says, boy, we got all the best minds and we've come up with this wonderful academic, scholarly manual. And tell us what you've discovered, or what
what we've discovered now about this manual was rushed into press in December of 2006, actually into January 2007, after the country had voted decidedly against the Bush administration's policy in Iraq by electing all the Democrats in the November of 2006, calling for a change of the entire occupation in Iraq. And that's when the Bush administration unveils the surge strategy and essentially unleashes Petraeus and his document on us. And so Petraeus and again these folks with him it's primarily Army and Marines, came up with this counterinsurgency manual because we did not have one. We threw out the book after Vietnam, and they've rewritten it. University of Chicago Press published it as if it were an academic document. And as it turns out now, what they did was they essentially cut and paste into this document from anthropologists, sociologists, without citation. In other words, the document is one long-running case of plagiarism. Yet they're selling it to us as if this is based on research, historical scholarship, and so on. They'll footnote T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, but when it comes to some of the most important anthropological work that they're just stealing, essentially, and cutting and pasting into their document, they're not doing citation. And this was uncovered by the St. Martin's University anthropologist, David Price, and it's reprinted on the Counterpunch newsletter and website.
Yeah, if somebody wants to contact us by email or phone, I can get them the citation that you gave
Their
me.
response was that this is military doctrine, not a scholarly work, but then why did the University of Chicago Press publish it?
Well,
why sell it to us as if you have anthropologists working with you now, that you have actual real scholars? John Nagel has written a book. He's this counterinsurgency guru who is part of this process. Well, then don't sell it to us this way. Tell us it's just like as if some high school student was cutting and pasting from various texts and put together something that sounded good.
Yeah.
And that's really all it is.
Yeah.
And again, I've read the Counterinsurgency Manual, and again, the fundamental point it's missing, which is that when you are trying to use these tactics to enforce a foreign occupation, what history tells us is that they will not succeed unless you politically negotiate and compromise on the key political issues with those that you are in conflict with, and they don't fess up to it.
Okay, now a lot of people watching the program live in the 3rd Congressional District, which is represented by Brian Baird in the U.S. House of Representatives. And Baird went to Iraq a few times and let people from the Bush administration and from the military tell him how good things are going.
Yeah.
And now Baird says, wow, that surge is working, let's give it some time to work. And what's your thought on that?
Yeah, well, Brian Baird deserves, I think, deserves our respect in one sense that he initially opposed the war in Iraq. He took a courageous stand. He's a smart, thoughtful congressman on many issues.
And he's a nice guy. He was a friend of mine from the 90s, from the 1990s.
Yeah, it should not be a personal issue with him at all.
That's right.
However, it should be a political issue because what he has done since then is he became very lukewarm in terms of his opposition to the war. So we sort of saw this coming. And then he has sort of refashioned himself as a kind of Middle East person for a variety of reasons. And he took these 2 trips to Iraq. It's really only 2 trips that he took to Iraq. He went to the region a few other times, but only 2 trips to Iraq. And both of them were quick 2 to 3 day CODEL congressional delegations visits, which we know are heavily scripted by the Pentagon.
Right.
And
they're not going to say, hey, Brian, just walk around any neighborhood you want and talk with the people on the street.
Yeah.
They're not going to do that.
Yeah, plus, you can't do that. And he has said he had full freedom to set his own agenda, but let's be real. When you're in the green zone, or you can only go out of the green zone if you're with a huge escort convoy, you really don't have many options here to talk with people on the street and get real opinions. You're going to get those who are hand-selected.
That's right. Yeah, John McCain. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so anyway, what Baird came away with was he really got the spin job.
Yeah.
Absolute spin job by these very intelligent and persuasive new military team that's in there under Petraeus. I think he even got a PowerPoint presentation at Crocker's, Ambassador Crocker's residence. Maybe I think Petraeus did a little meet and greet there. And he's come away with absolutely sharing the rhetoric of the Bush administration now, not based on any independent observation or facts, but based on the information he was spoon-fed. And he's bought into it hook, line, and sinker in even outrageous ways. He even says things like, if we were to leave Iraq right now, it would break into a near genocidal conflict. Women would be forced to wear burqas. And women would be stoned for getting stoned to death for getting education. None of this is true. Women don't wear burqas in Iraq. They wear different kinds of garb, headscarves and other things. This is not reality. Plus, the violence that has happened in Iraq so far has basically ethnically cleansed much of Iraq that we have kind of enabled. And therefore, it's not likely there to be sort of a genocidal mayhem if we left. In fact, there's largely stabilized lines right now. There would just be civil conflict on those lines.
But it reminded me of when a while back, John McCain
Yeah.
went over there and said, "Oh yeah, it's perfectly safe. I'm walking around," and then people got him to admit that he actually was heavily guarded.
Yeah, you
and
put
it
back
was-
the camera
yeah,
and you see he's actually got a huge military
and that's
presence
the,
around
this
him.
phony
Yeah.
baloney spin job.
But I think Baird is a good example here of why the Bush administration has actually turned to this sort of new counterinsurgency strategy, because it was a way to sell, it was a way to revive support for the war.
Yeah, it's basically to con the American people.
Absolutely,
Because
yeah.
the actual reasons for the war,
Yeah.
the oil and the geopolitical dominance
And the
stuff,
bases, yeah.
all that stuff are the realities, and the
Yeah.
American people were not supporting that. And
Yeah.
so this basically is a way to, I mean, it's a marketing scam. Like,
Absolutely,
you know, like you said.
yeah. And I think primarily it's to try and get Democrats, to try and put Democrats on the ropes so that they don't actually cut funding for the war,
Yeah.
which is the way you stop this war, is you cut funding for the war.
Yeah.
That is the solution, and he's trying to prevent that.
Let's talk just a bit. We don't have too much time, but
Sure.
I do want to raise the issue about violence and nonviolence, because we've
Yeah.
talked about how these kinds of violent tactics don't work.
Yeah.
And we've talked about how there are real political grievances that people have where, without other alternatives, they latch onto acts of terrorism and so forth. So what would happen if we looked at violence and nonviolence? What would, for example, if Gandhi in India, or Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the U.S., where you have populations that are severely disadvantaged relative to the dominant power structure, but who chose nonviolence. Can you talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, well, let me put in the context of our discussion of asymmetrical war. In a context of extreme asymmetry between the powerful and the weak, as I've just been saying in our discussion, the powerful, when they use their superiority and raise the asymmetry of the conflict, they're likely to be unsuccessful, right? They're likely to encourage all those factors that led people to oppose them and come in heavy-handed and be counterproductive and so on. So the best strategy for the more powerful in this kind of asymmetrical conflict would be to reduce the asymmetry, would be to try more peaceful means, try to use political strategies to divide the insurgents from the people or the terrorists from popular support, to win hearts and minds, to use police methods, etc., right? Reduce asymmetry. The same, except in reverse, is true for the other side. For the weaker side in a conflict, when they use these very violent tactics like suicide bombings, driving planes into buildings, etc., what they're trying to do is level the playing field. They're trying to decrease the asymmetry. But in fact, what that usually does is also counterproductive, because that causes the stronger side to come in heavy, to kill their people, etc. It usually is counterproductive for them as well. Their best strategy quite often, and I can make this example with the Palestinian case, is actually to heighten the asymmetry, to use nonviolent means against the military dominant power, to make it David and Goliath, right? And the Palestinians did this in what was called the First Intifada. The Intifada is just an Arabic word for uprising.
And kind of shaking off.
It means shaking off, literally.
Shaking off the,
And in 1987, Palestinians, after 25 years of Israeli occupation, finally said enough. And they rose up in resistance, and they did not use suicide bombings. That doesn't happen for 7 years later. They did not use primarily military strategies. There were only a few soldiers, Israeli soldiers, who were killed. What they primarily used was mass civil disobedience in the streets, much like Gandhi did in India, and they confronted the Israeli military, who did not know how to deal with them. Would fire into the crowd, killed people, then would end up broke thousands of legs and arms, because that was the only violent strategy. They realized they were losing the war of public opinion because they were so overreacting and so violent. And the Palestinians actually made great achievements by using a nonviolent civil disobedience strategy that ultimately got Israel to the peace table. Unfortunately, Israel did not go far enough to really make that a peace happen. But my view is the Palestinians have made that the extremist groups who use suicide bombings have actually made a terrible strategic mistake by using these, let alone they lost the moral high ground because they were killing innocent civilians and people inside Israel, which sent absolutely the wrong message and was immoral in addition.
Very often there are quotations after a conflict where the oppressed people have used nonviolence. There have been quotations afterwards from the former oppressors saying, we knew how we could have used violence, but that wasn't working. And when the oppressed people used this nonviolence, we were just bamboozled, we were discombobulated,
Yeah,
we didn't know how to deal
right,
with it.
right.
And there are quotations from Nazi oppressors in
Yeah.
Norway during
Yeah.
World War II. British people had said that about the people in India with Gandhi's movement, and it's popped up several places where
The police in the South, when
Yeah.
African Americans were rising up
you
for their
bring
freedom.
out the fire
against Jim Crow
hoses and the
apartheid.
police dogs,
Yeah.
and that doesn't
Yeah,
work.
exactly. Yeah.
So what happens is nonviolence actually changes the dynamics of the conflict, and it flips. Some people refer to it as a moral jujitsu, where
Yeah, right.
in jujitsu, where you use your adversary's weight against
Right.
him.
Or like Aikido, for example.
Or that
yeah,
kind of a
exactly.
thing, yeah.
No, nonviolence is quite often the superior asymmetrical strategy for the weaker
Yeah.
side. However, there are some cases where the dominant side leaves no room. The dominant side is so dominant that it cuts out. So for the dominant side to blame the weaker side for violence, like Israel is always blaming Palestinians for using this violence, they need to actually turn in and look at their own strategies, which have consistently made the use of violence the more likely strategy for Palestinians. Let's say in that case.
I wonder, can we take like about 1 minute for 1 or 2 minutes at the most for policies that you would recommend? You know, how do
Yeah.
we get out of this stuff? What are some better ways to look at this?
Yeah.
And then we'll do just a quick closing thought.
Yeah.
So what would you recommend?
Well, again, with our theme here of recognizing that we're now in these asymmetric situations, the United States is with its vast superior power, and responding to 9/11, for example, it seems to me the two superior policy alternatives to a war on terror, which is mistaken, counterproductive, and I think escalated the conflicts that we saw. First of all would be the international policing option, to treat terrorism as a crime and to pursue it as you would any kind of crime. You could do some preemptory investigative strategies and tactics, but to label it as a crime, not to give those who commit these acts of terrorism any political respect or dignity, which is really what we did.
Yeah.
We built them up into this great enemy, which is how they're able to recruit right now, as we talked about, help their marketing strategy. And then secondly, part of the aspect of sort of what classic counterinsurgency strategy tells you is that this is primarily a political conflict. And you have to address the political issues in a real way, not this light way that I think we're trying to do in Iraq right now. But what you have to do is separate the terrorists, for example, from the broader population, and that means you need to meet the concerns of the broader population. And in the Arab and Muslim world, it's clearly foreign military occupation is the #1 issue. We need to end those occupations, whether Israel's occupation of land it's occupying or our own military occupations. You've got to get the boots out of the ground. That's what creates the suicide bombing. That's what creates a lot of the conflict. You have to end support for tyrannical and corrupt governments in the Middle East, which we've supported for many years.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia and others.
Absolutely. Saudi Arabia would be
bunch of others
the great
less well
example.
known.
Yeah. And then thirdly, I think you have to end all these grotesque violations of human rights like Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, etc., that have fueled hatred and anger at the United States. You have to take away those issues that terrorists can use to mobilize people to yourself. And the final issue, I would say, is we need to end this state of fear that's being promoted in the United States that has led to this great erosion of our civil liberties. There's a fabulous book by Lawrence Wright, a New Yorker writer, who wrote for the New Yorker magazine, called The Looming Tower, the story of 9/11 and Al-Qaeda. And he talks about this one moment where the CIA knew that two of the eventual hijackers of 9/11, they knew they had entered the United States. And they were in a room in Minnesota, and they were meeting with the FBI, and they refused to turn over those pictures. Had they done so at this time, according to Lawrence Wright, and this has been backed up by many who have been in on this issue, we probably could have had leads that would have prevented 9/11. In other words, we had the information. We didn't need to violate people's human rights, civil liberties, etc., to stop terrorists. We just needed to get our act together.
Okay,
So.
thanks. I appreciate all the knowledge and insight you've shared, Steve. We want to be clear that Steve and I are not defending terrorism. We're not defending suicide bombers, but it's important, if we're going to solve these problems, it's important to understand what those problems are and what the underlying problems are. We're the only military superpower in the world now, and we should really question if that's a good thing. And there's an old saying that says If your only tool is a hammer, you'll treat every problem as if it were a nail. And that's part of the problem that we have. We want to thank Steve, thank the folks for watching. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. The world needs exactly what you have to offer.